Musicality.
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 So what is musicality? Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to Whatkeys. And today we are going to be answering the age-old question of what is musicality. Now, if you've been in musical circles before, you've probably heard the terms thrown around a whole bunch. Probably used to describe people's qualities and how their playing sounds, for better or for worse. Like good musicians, we say have really good musicality. Some people we label as not having musicality, but lots of technicality. Other people we say don't have musicality and are kind of bad. But at the end of the day, what does musicality actually mean? And it feels incredibly difficult to actually pinpoint and define because it's such an abstract topic. Before we move on to our discussion of musicality, I want to answer first the question of why do we even want to talk about this? Well, when I think about teaching technical things on this channel, as I have done previously in some of my tutorials, I've realized that there are some things that I want to be on the same page with you on before I get onto them. The first thing that I want us to agree on is that a musician is someone who wants to communicate, someone who wants to tell a story, someone who has something to say. That was the purpose of my video talking about who is a pianist. The second thing then that I want us to think about is what is good communication, right? After we have the goal of wanting to communicate, the why, then we want the what. What is actually good communication? Now, when we talk about musicality is often wrapped around how well someone performs on an instrument, how well someone compellingly tells a story on an instrument, how well someone portrays emotionality in their playing. And so I think it's an apt discussion to have at this point to talk about what precisely is good playing. And then, and only then, can we talk about how do we get good at playing. Once we have the why, once we have the what, then we can move on to the how. At this point, normally I would get on to divulging my thoughts on what is musicality, but again, it's really hard to define. So instead, I had the idea of getting several of my friends who are musicians to all sit down with me and have discussions on what musicality means to them. Some of them are EDM producers, some of them are classical pianists, some of them are hobbyists, and some of them are professionals, but each of them have their own unique experiences, own unique thoughts, own unique approaches to musicality. So in this video, I'm going to be taking parts of those discussions, putting them all together so that you can watch it and perhaps gain some new perspectives and new insights. Now, I will say that if you would like to see any of the full-length discussions, they are available on my Patreon for you to consume in video podcast format. So I would really appreciate it, since this was a very long project. There was a lot of people involved and it took a lot of time to coordinate and get together. So your support on Patreon would be greatly appreciated, and also because they're really interesting and I think you should take a look. But anyways, be sure to stick around to the very end of the video, because that's when I get interviewed and I discuss what musicality means to me. And with all that being said, let's get to the video. How would you define the term musicality?
It's a big word, but it's generally a positive word. Musicality means something good. When I think about musicality, I'm thinking very big picture of like, okay, there are some sounds that when we play them together or like in a certain order, like it sounds good. And that's good as like a qualitative, not even getting to like pleasant or anything. That's like this big, vague, beautiful idea that's way up here. And then we're down here trying to figure out what that is. A lot of times when people talk about musicality, they're talking about a specific danger. This is what it makes me think about. A specific danger that comes from pursuing technique simply for the sake of technique. This is my perspective. Technique should always be in service of musicality.
In talking about like this higher standard, why do you as a musician strive for something like that?
It's beautiful sometimes, and it's really fun to make art. There's something in human beings that we like pursuing that. And it isn't just in music where we're pursuing this idea of musicality and we want to create beautiful music. It's in all the arts.
With this definition of musicality, how does all that come together into a performance for you?
Usually it starts with like this vision that I have for like the perfect gig. I've written songs with the form of the perfect gig and be like, oh, what would be the perfect opening song? And it's incredibly intentional. The storytelling's even in the writing of the songs. The best part about it is that the audience is there. This is what I was talking about when I was talking about the element of the transcendent and why it's important for me that my music, if I want people to feel something and I want them to sing it back to me, and not just because like, oh, that sounds nice. I want them to like sing it back. That's when I really feel the transcendent side of music. Like it has to be about something, and it has to have the truth. It has to have something good at the center of it. That's what's going to work best, I think.
How would you define musicality?
How to describe musicality? Let me think. I would say that musicality, it's a very broad term that defines how to make music sound pleasant. For example, you have the notes written in the sheet music. It's one thing to play the notes correctly. Musicality takes it to a next level. When you consider the musicality, you're thinking about how to make this passage sound musical and how to put your own interpretation into this music. It's about how to transform your intentions, your emotions through the music and into the audience. I think musicality comes in both directions. Like you have from the performer to the audience, right? If the decisions that the performer makes, but at the same time, the audience also perceives something, right? All these types of different things actually influence how the music sounds and how the music is perceived by the audience.
What does good musicality sound like in any piano or classical piano, and what does bad musicality sound like?
It's very difficult to really come up with a very defined cutoff between good and bad. Perhaps good musicality is you need to have a very well-defined story to tell the audience.
With classical, there's like a large birth of like history behind how to interpret Bach, how to play Beethoven. With any piano, it's all very, very new, right? So do you feel like in any piano, there's a more room for musicality, whatever that means, right? Because you're not restricted by audience expectation, you're not restricted by like the history of interpretation as well.
For like anime piano covers, I would say it's completely different from classical music. I would say that for anime piano music, there's a lot more freedom, but at the same time, there's less to work with.
Could you define musicality, particularly in dance?
The first thing I always mention, especially when I talk about like b-boying, breakdancing, is that it's a dance, and every dance needs music. Core aspects of hip hop is breaking, MCing, BD art, and DJ. Going back to musicality, like to me, it's a part of the culture. That's like what I'm trying to get at. Just as important as the moves are, so is the music behind it, and the DJs that go behind it, and the MCs, you know, that call out, get the crowd hype. Choreography is completely different to what b-boying is, because with b-boying, a lot of it is freestyling. You go in, you feel the music, and you dance to the flow of the music, versus choreography. It is very choreographed. It is very stagnant. The musicality you have in breaking, it is what drives you, versus in maybe choreography, you know, you think of the move that goes along with the music. Musicality with choreography, it's especially when you look at like hip hop beats. Some people like to focus on the lyrics, whereas other people like focusing on maybe like the bass hits. And what I've noticed, like with the different people that were choreographing in our group, is that people chose what they wanted to choreograph too, but it all kind of works.
So I'll use B-Boy Pocket as an example, right? Pocket only does power. People will say Pocket or like power heads like that aren't very musical. How do you find musicality in something that is just such a tremendous physical feat?
If you actually watch B-Boy Pocket and listen to the music, you'll see it. Like he is dancing to the music, but he's just on his hands hopping around. And this is the reason why like Pocket is someone who does dance to the music, is especially like when he ends on a freeze. And again, with breakbeats, right? Drums ending on like a cymbal crash, right? Like he will always hit it. You know, someone who has no experience b-boying sees someone out of control, and all of a sudden they can just stick a freeze, just like that. You know, right on the cymbal crash, right on the build up. That guy has control.
What does musicality mean to you?
I would say, in my opinion, musicality is how you express yourself through the piece you're learning, both to convey emotion and to tell a story in what you're playing. Some things that pop into my head when I think about musicality are your dynamics, your phrasing, how you play each note, especially in the melody line.
So would you say then that like musicality comes first and foremost from how the piece makes you feel?
Yes, I would say, because obviously primarily when the composer makes, I assume the composer is using that to tell some kind of story.
How do you essentially separate between the composer's musicality, or is there like really no like distinguishing factor?
There's definitely a distinguishing factor, and that's something I'm also working on right now. So what the composer puts down on the score, you're playing that. What makes your own musicality separate from the composer's is, one, you cannot play it exactly like the composer played it. All of those things, though they are subtle, they're going to make a different overall feel of the piece.
What would you define as being creative with your musicality in any piano or classical music?
In any piano, usually the songs I arrange or I see other people arrange, they have lyrics. Lyrics tell a story very clearly. You know what pretty much exactly what emotions they're trying to convey. If I'm arranging something that's full size, I want there to be differences in what I'm playing. Then for classical, I would almost say it's similar to any piano, but it's less straightforward. You're given the syllables, the emotional colors, but you're not given any of the words. You have to put your own sentences on by stringing together different pieces of the measures, the lines, stringing those together to make words, to make sentences, to make yourself a story.
What does musicality mean to you?
Musicality means to me the way we facilitate our emotions into our music. You know, you can talk about, oh, I can play the scale super fast and super proficient, but what's the emotion behind it? I think the musicality is more like all these little tricks you can pull out when you're performing and like writing a piece so that you can convey your emotion better within the song. You can have very musicality about you, but not be like super proficient or like technical. You still need to have some technical understanding to then put that musicality behind it.
Where do you see good musicality and artistry coming in for something like mixing and mastering?
For a recording engineer, especially mixing and mastering, you can definitely add stuff that would like totally change the dynamic of the song. When you're mixing and mastering, you can completely just move things around in the song and create a whole new song based on just the recordings you're given. You can change the dynamic of the levels between the instruments so that the emotion really comes out in certain parts of the song. And that's ultimately like your job as a mixing and mastering engineer, is really trying to convey what the artist is trying to express in that song. You can add like kind of like a delay onto the vocal, and that just changes like the emphasis of certain words. So all of a sudden the vocal melody is now altered in a musical sense, right? I've even seen auto-tuned used as an instrument and not just to perfect the vocal. The musicality in that sense is also altered based on the mixing engineer's decision to be like, I think it'd be really cool if we use the tonality of the auto-tune. The most famous mixing engineers have their own flavor to add to songs. Mastering is definitely kind of the art of subtle changes. They bring the life out of the mix. You could have a mix that sounds awesome, but then it comes time to master it, and if you don't have like a mastering engineer that like really understood the band or like the musicality of it, you're gonna lose that sense.
How would you define the word musicality?
For me, I think musicality, it encompasses a lot of skills. So like, I think there's like more than one aspect. There's a lot of important parts, like having rhythm, being able to write music, improvisation. For me, it's the ability to like tell a story.
How would you go about honing this set of skills that you feel contribute to musicianship or musicality?
I think that most people just have to put hours and hours of practice into piano in order to develop their ability to communicate. You can't like phrase something naturally the first time you do something. You need practice. You need to know where you're going. You need to know what kind of story you want to tell, and you want to have like a guideline, a baseline of where you're starting and then where you finish. If you've developed your technique more, you have more options for what you can say to your audience musically.
So how much would you say then that musicality should be judged off of the audience's ability to understand what the musician is saying?
If you can connect with the music, I feel like the audience can also better connect with the music because they see you having a good time on stage or whatever. They feel intrigued by it, and I feel like a lot of the times that's what Animens is doing. That's what Theaster is doing during concert. They're really connecting with the music. They have a story behind it, and as long as they can like communicate that they are enjoying this, they love doing what they love doing, and they express it through their music, then I feel like that's what the audience is looking for, and that's where the audience really realizes, oh, this is, and if you explain it to the audience, this is what musicality is, and they're just witnessing it.
Do you feel like the musicality that's required for jazz is slightly different from something like anime?
It's a lot different because, I mean, you're going to be having improvised solos, and generally when you are playing jazz piano, you're going to be playing along with a jazz band. What you're actually playing during that is going to be very much different from what you play as a soloist.
How would you define the concept of musicality?
For me personally, musicality is how you embrace the world and yourself through music. I'm coming from a gospel lens, and so for me, musicality is all about gospel. It's all about how I can make rhythms and beats that work with choirs and multiple groups of people. It is having music that makes people feel good. It's having music that gives hope. It's about the knowledge of the music that you're producing and what it has the ability to do.
Is that more so how music makes the performer feel or how music makes the audience feel?
For gospel singing, it's how it makes the audience feel. Because it's a form of worship and because it's a form of sharing the gospel, it's really never about you. We are not here for us. This is not a concert for us. This is a concert for God. That it's an experience for the people in the audience.
In gospel music, what is an example of like good musicality?
Being able to mix 20 plus voices into one, but then also having a vocalist that's a soloist that knows how to blend with a choir. Having not only that unit to keep the song together, but the talent you need to ad-lib, the talent you need to not overpower the rest of your singers, but stand out as a soloist.
To me, when I think about gospel music, I think of the rich history behind it. Does that play into how you experience the music or things that you want to express?
You have to understand the history and still know how that impacts gospel today. Because gospel songs were freedom songs, really. Black people in the middle of a really, really crappy time, full of just oppression and shackles and chains. This was the one thing that they really held on to. A lot of just great cultural moves that really bonded the community after such, an experience.
How would you define musicality? Like, what does musicality mean to you?
Caleb, when you first, asked me what musicality was, sometimes you just listen to a piece of music, close your eyes, or you play that music. You can sort of feel like an emotion or like an intention behind it. Musicality to me is when the artist sort of understands what the purpose or the emotion or the intention of that piece of music is, and they sort of use their personality and their own interpretation to best express that emotion or that feeling as they have themselves.
Most of the time with classical music, you're looking at scores, you're looking at sheets, and you're being taught like an orthodox way, or what your teacher believes is an orthodox way of playing a certain composer. How do you work your sort of musicality, your emotions, your ideas into the music itself? You
listen to that music, and for me, it was just I could tell what it should sound like. Critics will always find a way to lambast either approach, but at the end of the day, it's what you want.
Have you ever felt like you, as the performer, vanished and the music was just left when you were playing for others?
I think I can count a couple instances, but I think the times of come closest are just when I've mastered the piece as much as I would. Because for me, it's usually the technique that's the hardest. That's the biggest block towards expressing musicality.
Where's your head at when you're performing to help you get to that place?
Weird. I feel like I don't really think. When I was in this competition once, there was this girl who was really good. I read this article where she was quoted as saying before the piece, I mentally visualize it's a swan piece. I mentally visualize the swan, etc. And I read that. I was like, does everyone do that? Because that's definitely not what I do. And I'm in a competition or just recital, I usually I just close my eyes and I just try to make it sound as beautiful as I want it to sound like.
Chris, what does musicality mean to you? Either when you're putting together a record or when you're thinking about mixing or mastering.
To me, it's talent and originality combined. I think that it's also the flow of music. When we're listening to something, does it allow us to immerse ourselves within the music? Something that has more musicality will draw you in deeper and deeper. Not everybody's going to have the same taste as the musician. The music that he writes is a reflection of his musical taste. How well he translates that, his musical taste, into his own work is his own musicality.
You as the mixing and mastering engineer, how do you feel like you exercise a degree of musicality there?
I think every engineer, they develop over time, they develop their own process and technique and their own workflow. a lot of times engineers have a certain set of hardware or plugins that they reach for because they're comfortable with it and they know what that sounds like. Over time, as my studio developed and grew, I started to use more analog hardware.
If I remember correctly, you started running sound at a time when you had no idea how to run sound.
You asked me if I knew how to run a soundboard, I lied and I said yeah.
So how did you go about developing musicality from that sort of place?
For anybody that wants to develop their musicality, have an open mind and listen to music. Just listen, okay? And listen for the things that you are currently working on. I mean, it took years to understand how to approach certain scenarios, listening to other records or listening to podcasts or watching people on YouTube or the internet and their techniques. Again, I think all of this kind of just comes with time. You know, listen to music, have an open mind, watch masters do their work. Eventually, you're going to find something that works for you.
In your own words or in your own experience, how would you describe the concept of musicality?
Musicality is the culmination of musical theory and knowledge, technical skill, and creativity, or I guess artistic interpretation of music.
Do you feel like musicality changes when you're talking about an arrangement as opposed to just playing?
Yes, but also I think arranging for me involves starting from scratch, right? Whereas if you're performing someone else's arrangement, you have the notes there, so it's all about how you want to play each note, right? I would say that my arrangements are usually how I would want to listen to the song on piano, right? Because my arranging style has developed differently over time, I always look back at my older arrangements and I'm like, oh, I can learn something from this. But also I'm like, wow, this is actually a bop. And for me, it's mostly number one is enjoyment and how I can also improve.
What sort of elements are you listening for in the original song, and how does one arranger differ from another?
First and foremost, the style of the song. For me, I look in my repertoire of skills, right? Like in terms of, do I want to play jazzy? Do I change up the rhythm? Do I want to slow it down a little bit? And what sounds the best and what works in the song is what I usually end up choosing for the arrangement. Going back to, I guess, different arrangers. That all comes down to like the artist's style, right?
How would you suggest someone become more creative with their musicality?
Look at different performances from different musicians or pianists with different styles. Especially the musicians who might play the same piece, and if they interpret it very differently, it might be useful to, watch critically instead of recreationally.
What does musicality mean to you?
I guess musicality is really cool to me because I particularly view music as something universal. There's no barrier to listening to music and to enjoying it, most importantly. Now, musicality to me, in terms of music production, that might be a little different. In terms of music, really, it's just all sounds. It's all the same thing. I think the enjoyment part is really what brings music to the musicality. If you listen to it and you feel something. I think if you have an origin of that and want to tell your story, then who's to say that one is better than the other? A lot of people don't realize there's so much that goes into making songs, especially with the EDM, like the sounds. Like you have a palette, you have to choose different sounds that work well together.
Do you mean enjoyment as in like the artist's enjoyment, or do you mean enjoyment as in the audience's reception?
I think both. The enjoyment that I get as an artist comes from the audience itself. And in a way, it's really cool to see people dance and feel something when you're up there on stage. I think if I didn't enjoy music then no one else would have enjoyed the music that I'm making and what I'm playing. Yeah, I don't really think there's such a thing as bad musicality. It's just like amateur learning the ropes kind of musicality, unrefined versus someone who's been doing it professionally. But in terms of enjoyment, someone can enjoy it as much as someone's popular song.
How does EDM production look like, and how does your creativity sort of like work into like that sort of workflow?
I would say that my answer is good artists copy, but great artists steal. I'm notorious for referencing other people's work, but not in like a way where I'm like completely like taking the idea, listening to music and being like, what do I like about this song? So it's not necessarily all copying artists, but in a way it's kind of like taking different ideas and melding them into one. And I think that's where the creative part comes in.
Is there a way that you see artists doing, or perhaps for yourself, to make your song at least stand out a little bit?
I think it's the technicality, really. A lot of producers know what effects to use, and they also like to break their DAW. They're essentially just like experimenting and breaking their songs to make them sound better or unique, and that's what gets people hype.
In your experience, how would you guys define musicality?
You asked us the question a few days ago and we didn't really get a chance to talk until this morning we were driving out. Claire asked me first. My answer was, it's the ability to speak music.
And then And I was surprised because that's exactly what I thought. We think of music as like a language. Musicality would be like the ability to communicate your ideas through music to your audience.
Learning a piece, I try to look at all the markings together. In teaching a lot of students, or even professionals, they say that I'm just learning the note, but I don't believe in that. I really think you should get all the elements together at once. Dynamics especially are important. And I think dynamics are kind of the roadmap, what the composer is telling you the directions he wants the music to go. Related to musicality, I think someone musical always understands dynamics. They understand how to pace things so that you don't reach a climax too soon. They understand how to end a phrase nicely with dynamics, how to start a phase, like not starting too loud. It's just like speaking a sentence. Usually the sentence will have a few main words, and then at the end of the sentence, your voice will trail off.
Musicality is the way you communicate to your audience and the ability to do that, right? In a way, if you're presenting something but you're not really interpreting, that's in a way not musical. It's kind of like you're given a speech, but you don't speak that language. You just know how to pronounce the words. Like you can practice really hard. If somebody was to tell you, inflections and this and that, work really hard for it. But I think the people who do speak the language can always kind of tell something is not there.
How do you get someone to finally, for the first time, like hear, oh, this is what's musical about a piece. This is what good musicality is, and then begin to formulate their own ideas, perhaps, on how to play?
There's no one way to do it. One of the things I found that was quite different in my students is if on a regular basis the student is always in contact with arts, with music, they tend to pick up these musicalities a little sooner. In a way, I guess they listen more. And so a lot of it has to be what they do on their own time with music.
It also comes from a will. You can have a group of students all with the same training, but I think certain people have more will to really get it and just try and put in more effort.
How do you explain the concept of colors?
Definitely dynamic related. You can change the colors simply by playing it at a different dynamic.
Also control and the exposure to different sounds. There are 4 steps to creating good sound. 4th one, you have to listen as a feedback to see if it sounds like what you want. It's almost an indefinite number of ways to create different levels of that note. You have to learn how to control to always produce the level that precisely what you want.
First question that I'm gonna ask, did talking to all those people actually change your answer?
I think the answer is probably the same. The answers are very, very similar. It's just like, how does it play out? That's different.
Let's ask the big question. What is musicality to you?
Based on the strength of 13 other interviews and how I think about music in general, it comes down to the act of expressing your thoughts through music. It's the communication through music. Musicality is not just, your internal state of being. Musicality incorporates that interpretation into some sort of communication to someone else. So the way that it's received by the audience actually matters, and how the audience is able to understand you matters as well. Interpretation could be the story that I want to tell. The musicality also plays into that, right? Because the thing that you want to say is impacted by the way that you say things. But the musicality not only incorporates the interpretation, but it takes the technical aspect of it and combines it into one.
What is good musicality, bad musicality?
What is good and bad musicality? Honestly, the more times I ask this question, the more I'm like, is there really an answer? There's the tangibles, right? No dynamics, right? No articulations, no phrasing, pedalings all over the place. Those are very quantitative things, but at some point they're also subjective, right? Because I could do the exact same thing. So I think the difference with good and bad musicality is that bad musicality is done without intent, and good musicality is done with intent. We're going back to, right, as I define musicality, how you talk through your music, the way that you're talking, the things that you're doing, your gestures, your emotions, your technique, everything is done with intent.
Do you think that you can learn that at any point, just how to play musically?
Yes. Musicality, especially since it's an art form, right, is something that's nebulous. What is the perfect way to communicate? Well, the perfect way to communicate is not universal for everyone. There's always a degree of learning. Even for the person for whom storytelling is, or storytelling in this capacity is very intuitive.
You have a background in audio engineering. Do you apply that when you record, for example.
In terms of how audio engineering actually affects my musicality when I'm performing or playing, the reason why I think about the separation in voices the way that I do is because I think sometimes in terms of frequencies. Literally all my musical experiences has influenced my thoughts on musicality. Hearing these things helps me audition in my own head like how things should sound and how I want things to sound, and then helps me then phrase it in the way that I wanted to. Alright, and that about does it for this video. Hopefully that was interesting to you and gave you some new perspectives and ideas to think about when you're approaching your own music. Of course, there's no hard and fast way to define musicality, as you probably just saw, so I would love to hear what musicality means to you down in the comment sections below. Be sure to check out my Patreon, where all the discussions are available in video podcast format for you to listen to watch, and to enjoy. Big thanks to everyone who participated in this. You guys are all incredibly talented. You guys gave me lots to think about and ruminate on, and it's really given me some interesting insights into my own playing and how I approach music myself. But anyways, if you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. If you would like to support the channel, you can do so on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or by getting Wildkeys merch. Be sure to catch my live streams on Saturdays, where I do lots of analysis live, or join my Discord for more updates. If you would like to see me do analysis on other people's playing, you should click right here. Or if you would like to hear me play, you should click right here. And until next time, everybody, peace.